G'day, this is Chris Savage from Our Real Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Acts. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you. Welcome to Acts 22:6 to 23:15. Last week, Paul finished his third missionary journey. He is back in Jerusalem. He's well received by the church. He catches up with James and the elders of the Jerusalem church, and he rehearses to them all that God had done on his third missionary trip. And there was much rejoicing amongst the church in Jerusalem. But there's a bit of a problem down there, because around about at this time, there were about 20,000 Jewish believers in and around Jerusalem. And what happened was there's a rumor that went around, and many of those 20,000 were actually zealous for the law, Mosaic law. So they still kept the law, even though they were believers in Messiah. But they'd heard a rumor that Paul had been teaching the Jews in the diaspora, those outside the land, to forsake Moses and the law. And so, to appease the situation in Jerusalem, under the advice of James and the elders, he took on a vow with four other men who were doing a vow. He took on a vow to show the church in Jerusalem, the believers in Jerusalem, that he still voluntarily followed the law. But we have some non-believing Jews who are in Jerusalem now for the feasts, and they are the ones from Asia, from up in Ephesus, where he had a lot of problems with them. And they're in Jerusalem, and they spot him, and they spot him with Trophimus, another Gentile believer from Ephesus, and they cause a riot in Jerusalem, where Paul now has to be rescued by the Roman soldiers from the fortress. And as Paul is heading up into the fortress with a cohort, on the steps of the fortress, he addresses the mob in Hebrew. The mob sounds Australian, doesn't it? Yes, he addresses the crowd in Hebrew, and he gives them his Jewish credentials, and he tells them that he was the persecutor of the people of the way, the church. He was heading to Damascus to bring them back to be imprisoned or killed. And so that's where we left off last session. And now this session, we see him. He's still on the steps of the fortress, and he's still telling his story to the mob. And in verse 6, it says, "It came to pass that as I made my journey and drew nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me." So this is the second time out of 3 times that there is a detailed account of the Damascus road experience, and in the book of Acts here. The first time Luke related the facts of the experience, and this time we have Paul's wording of it in this second account. First account was down in Acts chapter 9. In verses 6 to 11, he shares his experience on the road itself. And in verse 6, he tells us about the Shekinah glory light. Shekinah glory light, that's the visible manifestation of the presence of God. As to the timing, it came to pass as I made my journey. So this experience occurred on the trip from Jerusalem up to Damascus. He was drawing near to Damascus. The city was in sight, and about noon, or literally midday. And this Greek word we see here is used here in Acts 8:26. In Acts 8:26, it's the same word, but it has a slightly different meaning. It's translated there as toward the south. But the point here, in this passage in 22:6, the point here is that this light came when it was midday. The sun was at its hottest and at its brightest. So what Paul is saying here, that as bright as the sun was at noon, this light, this Shekinah glory light, was even brighter than the sun. That's what he's saying. And then he tells us what the event was. He said, suddenly, he says, there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And the Greek word means it flashed around him. This great light just flashed around him. And we only see it used here in Acts 9:3. And he calls it a great light because it was the Shekinah glory light. This is the visible presence of the Lord. And he says, and I fell onto the ground. So in verse 7, he fell onto the ground, and then he heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecute me? So we have this voice. It's called a bat call. It's a voice from heaven. It's a bat call. It's the daughter of a voice. And Paul's response to this voice and this light was to fall down to the ground. Now, falling onto the ground in light of the Shekinah glory would be a natural Jewish response. And then he hears this voice saying to him, he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And we have now Paul's question in verse 8. And I answered, who are you, Lord? So now the identification now came in verse 8, and the voice answers back. He says, I am Jesus of Nazareth. Literally it says, I am Jesus the Nazarene. Now this part of Paul's story, we don't see this back in Acts chapter 9, and we don't see it later on in Acts 26, because Paul is talking to a Jewish audience here. He's talking to a Jewish non-believing audience here. So we're not told about the Nazarene element except here in this account, because this was more appropriate to the Jewish audience before whom Paul is now relating his experience. Remember, this is the mob. This is not the believers. This is the Jewish non-believing mob. And the problem here is that Jesus is talking to him, and he says, whom you persecute. Jesus is saying, I'm the one you are persecuting. But he wasn't actually persecuting his followers. That's who he was doing. But Jesus is saying, no, you're actually persecuting me. To attack a follower of Jesus is to attack Jesus himself. That's what Jesus is here saying. He says, you are persecuting me. You're not persecuting the church. You're persecuting me, Jesus of Nazarene. And here we hear, and in verse 9, we have the response of the others with Paul. And concerning the light, and they that were with me beheld indeed the light. So they also saw the light, but they didn't hear the voice of the one who spoke. Remember, when we compare it back with Acts chapter 9 and 7, it means that they were conscious of a noise, but they couldn't make out any words. They were conscious that there was a noise going on, but they didn't know what the words were. Same here, just like they did see the light, but they didn't see Jesus. So they heard the voice, but they couldn't make out the words which the voice was speaking. And the response of Jesus now raised a second question by Paul in verse 10. What shall I do, Lord? Now, this question here shows the immediate submission to Jesus the Nazarene. And the answer comes back in the second part of verse 10. And the Lord said unto me, arise and go into Damascus. So Paul was to arise from his prostrated position and go into Damascus. He's to complete his journey. Now, although his journey will be for a very different purpose than what he originally planned, because he originally planned to go down to Damascus to go and drag out the people of the way down there and bring him back to Jerusalem. Now, the reason he must get into Damascus is because there it would be told him all things that were appointed for him to do. He's going to be sent on a mission. The Greek word for appointed here means to appoint or to order. And so this shows that Paul's calling had already been decreed by the time this Damascus road experience took place. So Paul has to now go to Damascus to find out what he's going to have to, what his mission will be. In verse 11, describes a journey into Damascus. And the problem he faced was, and when I could not see for the glory of that light. So Paul was now blind, same as in Acts 9:8, where Luke told the story. And the reason was for the glory of the Shekinah light. The Shekinah light blinded him. And even though the others also saw the light, but only Paul saw the glory of that light which blinded him. Now, solution to the problem was that he was now led by the hand of those who were with him. And the result was that he came into Damascus. And in verse 12 to 16, here we have his experiences in Damascus and the role of Ananias. Now, in verse 12, he tells us about the man Ananias. And the introduction is, and one Ananias. Now, as to Ananias' spiritual estate, Ananias was a devout man according to the law. So what he's saying to this Jewish mob here is that Ananias was also zealous for the law. And in Paul's account here before the Jerusalem Jews, Ananias' devotion to Judaism is now being stressed, because Paul wants to make sure, or he wants to make the same point about Ananias that he'd been making about himself, that his Christian faith in no way detracted from his loyalty to Judaism. Yet it was this one who was zealous for the law, Ananias, who introduced Paul to the new faith. So as to Ananias' reputation, it says that he was well reported by all the Jews who dwelt there. In other words, it wasn't just the believing Jews, he was still respected by all the Jews, both believers and unbelievers in Damascus. And this could also still be verified. That's why Paul is saying it. Now in verse 13, we have the restoration of the sight. And Paul says, Ananias came to him and stood by him. And this shows a closeness of the two men by this point. The command was, Brother Saul, receive your sight. Now, Ananias addressed Paul as brother, showing that by this time Paul was a believer and Ananias accepted him as a fellow believer. And the result was that in that very hour, Paul received his sight. The text literally says, I received my sight and looked upon him straight away. So Paul's sight's restored. And the evidence of it being restored was that he could see Ananias. And in verses 14 to 16, Paul now reveals Ananias' message to him. And the message of Ananias was not revealed in the first account in Acts 9. Because remember, again, Paul is here talking to unbelieving Jews. So he has to word his account differently. In verse 14, he points out Paul's unique appointment. And he said, the God of our fathers has appointed thee to know his will. Now, God of our fathers here is very strong Old Testament language. And again, he's talking to these unbelieving Jews. The Greek word for appointed here means to be put forth into one's hands, or to plan, or to determine, so as to take into one's hands beforehand. In essence, what this word emphasizes is that Paul's apostolic calling at this point. So Paul was now called into God's purpose in his apostolic calling, and Paul was called into God's purpose beforehand for three things. First of all, to know his will. Paul was destined to become a recipient of divine revelation. And what does that make Paul? It makes Paul a prophet, right? Remember, a prophet receives a special divine revelation from God and then passes it on to the people. And this is why Paul, for instance, knew uniquely all about the dispensation of the grace of God, because it was given to him by God. And the uniqueness of God's revelation to Paul is emphasized by Paul himself in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 to 13. So now, first thing is to know his will. First thing. And second is to see the righteous one. Now, who's the righteous one? Paul is to see the resurrected Christ. And what does that do? This qualifies him for the gift of apostleship. Remember, to be an apostle, one had to, for all the apostles, they had to have seen the resurrected Christ. So now Paul has seen the resurrected Christ. This qualifies him for apostleship. And we see he also says this in 1 Corinthians 9:1, that he says, hey, have I not seen Christ? Third thing he has to do, he has to hear a voice from his mouth. So Paul heard the audible voice of the Lord on the Damascus road, which was just described here. Okay, in verse 15 now, Ananias points out that Paul is to be a witness. So Paul, recounting the story, says, for you shall be a witness for him unto all men of what you have seen and heard. A witness for Jesus, that is. Paul is to be a witness to all men. And obviously here, the Jewish crowd did not catch on here that all people included the Gentiles. But when they catch on in verse 22, they're going to respond accordingly, quite differently. And the content here is all that Paul has seen and heard. So what Paul has seen is the righteous one. He saw the resurrected Christ, and he will hear the revelation of the will of God. And in verse 16, we have the baptism of Paul. And the impetus for this is Ananias talking to Paul. He says, and now why tarry you? After all, baptism needs to follow salvation. Once baptism is understood, should be no delay in its execution. And back in those days, because they were Jews, they understood the meaning of baptism. So they were baptized right away after salvation. When it says, what are you waiting for? It's, why you're tarrying means what are you waiting for? It's a very common Greek idiom and implies that it was time Paul acted on this commission from the Lord. Now today, very few people, today, not many people understand the true meaning of baptism because of all sorts of contradictory doctrines. So it might be best or wise to wait a little while until the believer understands the meaning of baptism before baptism is applied. Now we see here the command then is to arise and be baptized and wash away sins, calling upon his name. This is the second verse, along with Acts chapter 2, verse 38, that some people try to use to teach that baptism is necessary for salvation. Again, remember, same as Acts 2:38, which was quite a while ago, same as Acts 22:16 here. This is being addressed to the Jews, not to the Gentiles. It's being addressed to a Jewish audience. Why we talk about baptism here? Because the Jews who were members of that generation that Paul is in, that it's around him, they were the ones who were guilty of the unpardonable sin, which was guilty of the resurrection of the Messiahship of Jesus. Same thing as in Acts chapter 2, verse 38. Baptism will not save them spiritually. In fact, as we see here, by the time he was already saved, Paul was already saved prior to baptism. He had already exercised faith. He had already been addressed as a brother by Ananias. What baptism will do here is that it will save him physically from the AD 70 judgment. Remember, purpose of baptism is to identify with a group or a movement. And the Greek in this text, the Greek clearly shows us here that there are two distinct parts in this verse which must be kept distinct. So what we see here is that we need to keep these two things apart, keep them in mind here. Is how the verse should be translated. Literally is having arisen, be baptized and wash away your sins, having called upon the name of the Lord. In other words, the two parts of the sentence need to be kept distinct. the arising precedes the baptism, or the baptism follows the arising. The calling in the name of the Lord precedes the washing away of the sins, or the washing away of the sins follows the calling upon the name of the Lord. So, we call upon the name of the Lord, we're saved, sins are washed away. So baptism goes with the arising and not with the washing away of sins. Baptism follows the arising. Washing away the sins follows the calling upon the name of the Lord. So Paul's sins, let me simplify. Paul's sins were washed away by his calling upon the name of the Lord. The baptism here simply follows his arising to carry out that commission. There's a guy, F.F. Bruce, translates this verse as, rise up, get yourself baptized, have your sins washed away, calling in the name of the Lord. So the word baptized here means get yourself baptized, or submit yourself to baptism. Baptism is not essential to salvation, but it is essential to obedience and discipleship. In fact, it's the Great Commission is preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and then teaching them. So baptism is a part of discipleship, and it's a part of obedience to the Lord. Now, here we are in the temple. There's a temple vision he's going to talk about here. This is a temple vision that Paul experienced in verse 17. It took place between Acts 9, between his return to Jerusalem and his departure for Tarsus. Now, Luke did not record the event in Acts 9, but now Paul tells us about it in Acts 22. Maybe the reason Paul referred to it is that it indirectly answers the mob's charge that he had defiled the temple. A person who goes to the temple for prayer is not likely to desecrate it. If you have no regard for the temple, why bother to go there to pray? But Paul went to the temple to pray, and while he was praying, he now has this vision. So the occasion for the temple vision in verse 17 is, the time was when I had returned to Jerusalem. So he's back in Jerusalem, and this was after 3 years absence. While he was praying in the temple compound, the vision took place, and it says, I fell into a trance. And in this vision in verse 18, Jesus gave Paul a command. He begins with the appearance. And he says, and saw him saying unto me. This is saw Jesus saying unto me. And this is Paul's first visit back to Jerusalem, when his enemies tried to kill him. And this, you can read it, it's in Acts chapter 9, 29 to 30. Now at that point, back then, Jesus appeared to him while he was praying in the temple compound. Now, Jesus told him to make haste, which was get out of here quickly. He was to get you quickly out of Jerusalem. Why? He needs to leave as quickly as possible, because the reason is because they will not receive Paul's testimony concerning Jesus. Back then, they didn't receive Stephen's testimony either. And Paul spoke at the very same synagogue that Stephen had preached at. So they didn't believe Stephen, and they'll not believe Paul. So Paul is recounting what happened to him back in Acts chapter 9 area. Jesus says to me, get out of here quickly, because they're not going to believe you, mate. These are the guys who stoned Stephen. You need to get out of here. And in verses 19 to 20, Paul responded with a protest, because, he's protesting to Jesus. He points out to Jesus in verse 19, his own earlier persecution of the church. He says, Lord, he says, they themselves know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on you. So Paul is saying, look, hey, mate, I've got a track record with these guys. They know me, but that doesn't cut it with Jesus. The Greek word for in every synagogue literally means he went up and down in every synagogue. Paul went from synagogue to synagogue looking for believers, and he was pulling them out and imprisoning them. So Paul had a very convincing testimony that, I can share this with this crowd here. I can share this testimony. This is back in 9. Paul thinks here that their knowledge of this will keep them from wanting to kill him. because they'll know that he was once a much more active persecutor of the church. And they would know that something pretty dramatic must have happened to reverse his direction. So Paul is protesting to the Lord. And in verse 20, he reminds Jesus of his own role in the death of Stephen, as if Jesus didn't know. The timing was, and when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was shed, what was Paul's role during the death of Stephen? Was, first of all, he said, I was standing by and I observed the event, and I also consenting to Stephen's death. In other words, what Paul is saying, listen, Jesus, I was there when it was happening. I consented to his death. I was pleased with his death at the time. That's what it means. So Paul not only observed the stoning of Stephen, but he was pleased with it. He approved of the actions being taken by the Sanhedrin at that moment. And third, he says that he was keeping the garments of them that slew him. So he was guarding the clothes of the stoners. And in that sense, Paul identified with them. He felt that they knew his role in persecuting the church and in stoning Stephen. Therefore, he felt that they would not move to have him killed. And he's protesting this to the Lord, as if Jesus does know everything. But of course, Jesus knows better. And in verse 21, Jesus gave Paul a commission. He said unto me, the commission was to depart. So at this point, Paul left, went to Tarsus, where he remained for 10 years until he was fetched by Barnabas to Antioch of Syria. And the reason he must depart is because God will send him far from Jerusalem to the Gentiles. In Acts 9:15, he received a similar commission in Damascus from Ananias. Now remember, this is Paul recounting his experience. He's on the steps of the Antonia fortress. He was being, the mob were after him. He's addressing the mob. He's addressing the Jews who wanted to kill him. This is in Acts chapter 22. And he's told that he'll be sent far hence. So he's recounting his story to them. And the expression far hence is the same as to the uttermost parts of the earth. It's an idiom for the Gentile world. So he tells the mob here that he's being sent to the Gentiles. So the point he's making is, how could he do otherwise without being disobedient to God? And this ends the address. And now we see the arrest in 22 to 29. It begins in verse 22 to 23 by describing the mob's response. And in verse 22, we have the interruption of Paul's address. Paul had more to tell of the story, but he was now interrupted, and they gave him audience onto this word. So in the Greek, it means that the people kept on listening in respectful silence until he mentioned the word Gentiles. And the mention of the Gentiles stopped Paul's speech. It was not, and the reason that it stopped Paul's speech, it wasn't as the way some people think it is, that, because the mob was anti-Gentile, but because they weren't, because in fact, the Jews themselves were working on converting Gentiles to Judaism. But they reacted this way because Paul's way of converting Gentiles was without circumcision, without the law. So Paul was converting Gentiles without them having to first submit to Mosaic law. But and again, to highlight the fact that they're not anti-Gentile, because Jesus himself said that back in Matthew 23:15, he said to the Pharisees that they travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte. So they were actively proselytizing Gentiles. But the fact that he mentioned Gentiles at this point caused an uproar, because he was accused what? He was accused of what? He was accused of bringing a Gentile into the inner court. And since he was willing to convert Gentiles without circumcision, without submission to the Mosaic law, the mob felt here that perhaps he would bring uncircumcised Gentiles into the inner court as well. And so they lifted up their voices. The uproar began again, and they start yelling and screaming again. Remember, if a Gentile went from the outer court into the inner court, the Jewish people had every right to kill him, and the Romans allowed them to kill him if he crossed that line. A Gentile can't go into the inner court of the temple compound. And they cry out loud, and they said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." So this is a cry to kill him. And the reason they said this is because they believed it was not fit for him to live. And the Greek word for fit is used only here and in Romans 1:28. It emphasizes that there's an impatience about an obligation here. So the point they made was that it was not fitting, and Paul should have been put to death a long time ago. They've allowed him to live for too long. He should have been put to death a long time ago for what he has been doing, by converting Gentiles. In verse 23, we have the mob action. And when was it? As they cried out, they threw off their garments and cast dust into the air. What a sight that would have been. It pictures the mob here in a state of uncontrolled frenzy. And this uncontrolled frenzy, it's interspersed here with spasms of wild rage. And you can just imagine it, and they all the time they're demanding the blood of Paul, throwing dust in the air and throwing their clothes around. What a sight to the Romans. And then in verse 24, we have the actual arrest. And the reason here was that the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle. The castle is the fortress. So Paul is now brought in as a prisoner into the Antonia fortress. This is where Paul officially begins 4 years of bondage. And the command was bidding that he should be examined by scourging. And the means of examining Paul, and the word examined here has the idea of interrogation. The means of interrogating Paul was by the Roman scourge, the Roman whip. Scourging was regarded as a kind of torture in order to guarantee that the person would tell the truth. It was torture. And the purpose is that he might know why they so shouted against him. So the chiliarch or the captain of the guard, he still didn't know the specific accusation against Paul, but he was going to get to the bottom of it. Remember, Paul was talking to the Jews in Hebrew. He wasn't talking in Greek or Aramaic. And the captain of the guard couldn't understand what was going on. All he saw was, the mob were silent while Paul was speaking to them. And all of a sudden, they were back in an uproar again. So he doesn't know what's going on. And in verse 25, Paul now raises an objection to being scourged, as you would. Roman scourging, remember, a Roman scourge, most times people didn't survive the Roman scourge, they died. And the timing of the objection here was when they had tied him up with the thong. And the Greek word here literally means that they stretched him forward, tied him up, and to about to lash him. They were going to start lashing him once he was tied up. And at that point, Paul issued his protest. He's all tied up here, ready to be lashed. And as he was about to receive the first lash, he says, he raises the question almost sarcastically, by the way, he says, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? Whoa. Two laws were now being violated in this situation. First of all, it is very much illegal to punish a Roman citizen without giving him a fair trial. It is illegal. And that's why Paul, what he meant when he says uncondemned. Second, it was illegal to scourge a Roman citizen in any case. A Roman citizen cannot be scourged. Scourging was only allowed for a slave or an alien, a foreigner. So the steps that were being taken against Paul here violated Roman law, and the one who's violating Roman law is the chiliarch, the captain. And here now we have the centurion's response. The timing was, and when the centurion heard it, he went to the chief captain or the chiliarch and gave him the warning and told him, saying, "What are you about to do?" And the Greek literally reads, "What are you at the point of doing here?" It's in the Greek, the Western in the Greek, it's a sharp warning. And the reason it's a sharp warning is because this man is a Roman. And then we have the chief captain's response. And the chief captain came and said unto him, just to verify the report, he says, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And the Greek is very emphatic. It reads, "You, a Roman?" The chiliarch couldn't believe it. It seemed unbelievable to him that this man is a Roman. And Paul's response is, "Yeah, I'm a Roman. I'm a Roman citizen, mate." And then in verse 28, the captain wants to know how Paul received his Roman citizenship. He wanted to see how valid it was. He says, is this guy scamming me or what? So the chief captain answered, "With a great sum obtained I this citizenship." At that time, the Emperor Claudius, when he was ruling Rome, he actually sold citizenship. Roman citizenship could be gained in three different ways. First, it could be granted by imperial decree for services rendered to the state. It could be by birth, if you're born to a Roman citizen, and you could purchase at a very high price. And this was only, I think it was only Emperor Claudius who allowed you to buy it. So the captain here was a Greek by nationality, and he had to purchase his Roman citizenship from Claudius at a great sum of money. That's why his name is Claudius Lysias, Claudius named after the emperor. And Paul said, "But I am a Roman born." Paul said that he was born as a Roman, and the Greek literally means I have been ever born one. So he tells the Roman earlier that he was a citizen of Tarsus. Yeah, that was true. However, being a citizen of Tarsus did not make him a Roman citizen, because Tarsus was a free city. It wasn't a Roman colony. Philippi was a Roman colony, and everybody who lived in Philippi was a Roman citizen. Now, the family of Paul therefore obtained citizenship by the first method, by some imperial decree. But Paul obtained his citizenship by the second method. He was born to Roman citizens. Now, you might say, well, if people wanted to avoid a flogging, all they had to do was say, "Well, hey, hang on, I'm a Roman citizen." But the problem with that is that, by claiming to be a Roman citizen, if they found that you weren't a Roman citizen, you were liable to the death penalty. So, you wouldn't claim it willy-nilly. And when Paul declared himself to be Roman born, that now leads to the results of verse 29. As far as the scourging goes, he says, those who were about to scourge him immediately departed from him. These guys who are going to interrogate him through this and scourge him, the Greek says that they literally stood off from him at once. Washed their hands, mate. They had no desire to be associated with anyone who was about to scourge a Roman citizen, so they backed away. And the result here was that the chief captain was that he was afraid. Obviously, he was afraid because he had bound Paul to be scourged, and that was illegal for a Roman citizen. His life could have been lost. We're going to see Paul's defense now before the Sanhedrin. But on the morrow, the next day, desiring to know the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews. So what we see here is that the convening of the council of the Sanhedrin, we see in verse 30, it was the next day, and the reason for the action was because, the chiliarch, he wants to know the exact accusation against Paul because of all this mob violence. He still doesn't know what's going on. He wanted to know exactly what Paul had done wrong, and the Sanhedrin would obviously know why. And this convening was not for a trial. It was simply to seek more evidence about why is this mob so upset over Paul? Why they want to have him killed? I don't know what's going on. And what we see here is, first of all, Paul, he loosed him. He loosed him from the bonds because he was a Roman citizen. And second, he commanded the priests and elders to come together. So the Sanhedrin had no choice here but to meet together. But they had to meet not in the regular the hall of judgment. That was their normal meeting place. But now they have to meet in the Antonia fortress. And this included the chief priests, the 24 chief priests who were Sadducees, and all the council to come together includes the Pharisees. And the third thing here, he now brought Paul down and set him before them. So Paul is now brought and set before the Sanhedrin council in the Antonia fortress. And now Paul is going to give his defense. And said, Paul, looking steadfastly on the council, said, brethren. So he calls them brethren, fellow brethren. In this case, brethren doesn't mean believers, it means fellow Jews. And then he made the claim. He said, look, I have lived before God in all good conscience until this day. When the Greek says having lived, it means to manage the affairs of a city or to behave as a citizen. Paul is saying, he says, listen, I have lived as God's citizen, right? My conscience is clear. I lived in good conscience. We're going to see this again down further on in chapter 24, verse 16. So what he's saying is all of his actions were done in good conscience. Now, this was true. What he's saying is I did everything in good conscience. Now, even whether I was persecuting the church or when he turned to Christ, they were all done in good conscience. So, Paul is saying here, what he's saying is, he says, what he's virtually saying is, if my life as a follower of Christ left him in complete innocence before God, then the Sanhedrin members who did not share his commitment to Christ now appear to be the guilty parties. So he didn't endear himself to the Sanhedrin. And we have the high priest Ananias. But having given us this word of instruction, verse 2 gives the response of Ananias, the high priest. First of all, we see here his name, Ananias. In Hebrew, his name is Hananiah, which means Jehovah is gracious. This guy was the high priest under Emperor Claudius and under Emperor Nero from 47 to 59 AD. Son of a guy called Nedebius, appointed high priest in AD 47. Bit of background for you here. By Herod of Chalcis, who was the brother of Herod Agrippa I. Now, Ananias was known for being notoriously unscrupulous. Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes about this same high priest, and he says that he was insolent, profane, hot-tempered, and greedy. Not a man you want as high priest. And Josephus says that he seized for himself the tithes that were to go to the common priest. So he's a thief as well. So this high priest was known for his greed and rapacity. And 5 years earlier in AD 52, he was accused of complicity in an outbreak of violence between the Jews and the Samaritans. This is the high priest. And what we saw back then is he was deposed from his high priesthood and sent to Rome, but he was actually cleared of charges, and he returned to the high priesthood by Claudius as a result of intercession by Agrippa. Ananias had a very pro-Roman policy. He was very pro-Roman. And the Babylonian Talmud actually wrote about him. In a parody of Psalm 24, they said this about him. On this the temple courts cried out, lift up your heads, O ye gates, and let Johanan, which is a reversal of Hananiah, the son of Narbai, the disciples of Pingai means meat dish. They call me a disciple of a meat dish. Enter and fill his stomach with the divine sacrifices. This was the rabbi's own anti-Ananias statement. So he's the guy that Paul is before. He was finally deposed in AD 59, and in AD 66, what happened to him was he was assassinated by the zealots for his pro-Roman policy. And Josephus describes the details. He says that Ananias tried to hide in aqueducts. He was found and dragged out by the zealots, and he was put to death along with his half-brother Hezekiah. Remember, the zealots, they were those, we saw it last week, those dagger men. You know, they'd hide the Sicarii in their robe, and that's who he was killed by, the zealots. So everything we know about Ananias from secular history fits his actions, what we're going to see here in chapter 23. He now commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth, to hit Paul. And so those that stood by were the servants of Ananias. And so they smacked Paul on the mouth. And for Jews, this was particularly offensive, to hit someone on the mouth. And this was the same thing that they did to Jesus back in John 18:22. And in verse 3, we have Paul's response. Then Paul said unto him, and he now puts that same judgment upon Ananias. He said, God shall smite thee. And God certainly did smite him in the way that he died, as we just saw. Now, Paul then called him thou whited wall. What's a whited wall? A whited wall was a shaky, weak wall that was in a precarious condition. And what they would do is that they'd disguise this shaky wall by a generous coat of whitewash, make it look good. And truly, Ananias was in a very precarious condition for his actions. It was being disguised by a whitewashing his high priestly office. So the word whitewashing, Matthew uses it in 23:37, where Jesus accused the Pharisees of being whitewashed tombs. Basically, Paul is accusing Ananias of being a hypocrite. And then we see that sin next here. And sits you to judge me, Paul is talking to Ananias, he said, and sits you to judge me according to the law and commands me to be smitten contrary to the law. So here, Ananias, he was there to judge Paul according to the Jewish law, and yet he was ordering things to be done contrary to the Jewish law. And his striking of Paul was clearly against the Jewish law. It actually violated both Jewish and Roman law. Because remember, Paul's a Roman citizen. And in verse 4 here, we have the response of the bystanders, and they that stood by said, revile you God's high priest. Now, the office of high priest always required respect, even if the person who was the high priest himself didn't deserve any respect. Now, Ananias certainly didn't deserve any respect. And then Paul's response is, Paul said, I knew not, brethren, that he was high priest. So then this raises a question, you know, when Paul says brethren here, he means it again in the sense of fellow Jews. Why did Paul fail to recognize the identity of the high priest? Here we have four possible reasons, or four possible answers. First of all, we know Paul's eyes were weak and he didn't see very clearly. And we see this from other parts of the New Testament, that Paul had weak eyes. So maybe he just didn't see him clearly. The second thing we have here is that, you know, it had been many years since Paul was in Jerusalem, you know, and he hadn't been in contact with the high priest for many years. So, you know, the office had changed hands several times since Paul left. Maybe he just didn't recognize him. Third, because this wasn't a regular Sanhedrin meeting, but one that was called by the chief captain, Ananias may not have been wearing his high priestly garments since they were meeting in the Antonia fortress. If he was meeting in the hall of judgment, he would have been dressed that way, but possibly not here in the Antonia fortress. And the fourth, the most probable explanation is that Paul was using sarcasm. Paul simply said that he did not think that the high priest would speak like that. So, it's more of a sarcastic statement. So Paul admitted that the office of high priest required respect, yes, and he said it was written, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. And here Paul again, just to show he's not disassociated from Mosaic law. Here he is quoting from the Torah, from Exodus 22:28. And in verse 6 we have Paul's proclamation. Situation here is that, but when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, so he says, okay, he said, I got Pharisees and Sadducees here in this council. So Paul realized that he's not about to get a fair hearing by the actions of the high priest here. So he clearly shows that, he could be in trouble here. And because part of the Sanhedrin were Pharisees, another part Sadducees, and Paul being a Pharisee, he decided now to divide and conquer. He said, let me split the enemy right in the middle. So he cried out in the council. He cried out to the Sanhedrin, brethren, he says, or fellow Jews, I am a Pharisee. And he uses the present tense. He says, I am a Pharisee. And in his basic theology, this is true. He was a Pharisee theologically. And furthermore, he says he was a son of Pharisees. And this statement could mean one or two things. First, he was the descendant of a long line of Pharisees, or second, he was trained or discipled by Pharisees. And in fact, both statements were true in Paul's case. And he points out, touching the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. And this is essentially basically true because what was it? The issue was the resurrection of Jesus. It was a question of resurrection. And for Paul, it was the resurrection of Jesus. That's what he's talking about. Because it was the resurrection of Jesus, when Paul saw the resurrected Christ, he was convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. He saw the resurrected Christ and boom, he realized, hey, he is the Messiah. So the resurrection of the dead, remember, resurrection of the dead was affirmed by the Pharisees, but Sadducees, no way. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. So Paul simply, all he simply did was he put this amongst them. He virtually put the cat amongst the pigeons here. He raised the issue of resurrection because he knew that straight away it's going to raise this bone of contention between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Although for Paul, the specific issue was actually the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But you know what? He knows he's not going to get a fair hearing, so I'm going to set the cat amongst the pigeons here. And what Paul said in verse 6 accomplished the goal in verse 7, mate, which was now we had a division amongst the priest. Timing is, and when he had so said, or while he was saying this, then came the fact there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What? Where? Why? Over the issue of resurrection. And the result was that the assembly was divided. And in verse 8, Luke points out their theological differences. He says, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit. The Sadducees did not believe in spirits, angels, demons, or the resurrection. The Pharisees believed in all of these things. The Sadducees only accepted the law as scripture. And because they saw no reference to resurrection or any of these things in the law, they don't believe it. And in verse 9, we have a great clamor. There arose a great clamor, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees part stood up and strove. They were going backwards and forwards fiercely. It was a very lively fight. And with some of the Pharisees now taking Paul's side, saying, hey, we find no evil in this manner. And what if a spirit has spoken to him, or an angel? And they knew full well that these statements would now only make the Sadducees angrier, because remember, they don't believe in the spirits or angels. So they yelled out, perhaps Paul did receive a vision from an angel. They said this purely to irritate the Sadducees, because this too was denied by the Sadducees. And in verse 10 here, we have the rescue of Paul. It says, and when there arose a great dissension, we have the chief captain fearing lest Paul should be torn in pieces by them. It means he was worried that they're going to rip him apart. He became suddenly concerned because Chiliarch was responsible for the safety of a Roman citizen, and Paul's a Roman citizen here. So secondly, he commanded the soldiers to go down. He sent the army or the band of soldiers to take him by force from among them. They were to rescue Paul from the midst of the strife, not to arrest him, but virtually to protect him and to bring him into the castle or the Antonia fortress. And now we're going to see the Lord appear to him again. And at this point now, Paul now receives some divine assurance in verse 11. It says, the night following, meaning the next night, the Lord stood by him. So Jesus appeared to Paul 4 times in a vision. First time on the Damascus Road, where in his conversion, Acts 9. Second time was in the temple vision, which he just spoken about here in verses 17 and 21. The third time was when he was out on the foreign fields in Corinth, and the fourth time we see here in Acts 23:11. What was the purpose of the vision? It was to comfort Paul in his hour of trial. The Lord's words assured him that there was a divine purpose in all the things that are happening to him. Jesus now tells Paul 3 things. First of all, he says, hey, be of good cheer, be courageous. Jesus once told us to others in Matthew 9, 2 and 22. And second, for as you have testified concerning me at Jerusalem, so notice here that Jesus did not rebuke Paul for coming to Jerusalem. Remember Paul had a prophecy. The Holy Spirit said to Paul, this was going to happen to you in Jerusalem. And Agabus said, they're going to tie you up. And they're all trying to, dissuade him from going to Jerusalem. None of that from Jesus. In fact, Jesus compliments Paul for testifying of him in Jerusalem. So this shows that Paul was, boom, smack in the middle of the will of the Lord for coming to Jerusalem. And third thing he says, you must bear witness also at Rome. Hey, you're going to have to go to Rome as well. Jesus promised Paul that he will make it to Rome. Nothing will happen to him until he makes it to Rome. And this is a fulfillment of what was spoken to him in Acts 9:15. Now we see the deliverance almost there. We now have the oath taken by the people in verses 12 to 13. Verse 12, we have the content of an oath there. It says, when it was day, so the next day, and the act here is that the Jews banded together. It was a secret comment. It was a conspiracy. And they placed themselves under a curse. And the Greek word for curse here is a very strong word. It's anathema. And they placed themselves under anathema, or a curse meaning devoted to God. The curse here was that they would neither eat nor drink until they succeeded in killing Paul. And the number of guys who took this oath there in verse 13, it says that they were more than 40 that made this conspiracy. So these guys have sworn together to kill Paul. And in verses 14 and 15, we have the conspirators. They now get into the Sanhedrin. And in verse 14, and they came to the chief priests and the elders, meaning the Sanhedrin, chief priests, Sadducees, elders, Pharisees. And the act here is, we have bound ourselves under a curse, a great curse, and the curse is to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now we know that they failed to kill Paul, but did they keep the oath? Did they touch neither food or drink when they failed, when they broke their oath? What happened to them when they failed? It would be 9 more years before Paul was killed. And when he was killed by Romans, not by Jewish hands. So it's very doubtful that these 40 odd men actually starved themselves to death. Why? Because in rabbinic law, like most things in rabbinic law, they made provisions where you could get out of an obligation to keep an oath. Mishnah allowed an individual to be released from his vows by reason of constraint. And for instance, the Jerusalem Talmud said, he who makes a vow not to eat anything, woe to him if he eats. Woe to him if he does not eat. If he eats, he's sinning against his vow. If he does not sin, he sins against his life. So what should a man do in such cases? He must go to the sages and they'll loose his vow. In other words, what they're saying is that when one makes a vow not to eat, he has a contradictory situation here. Why? If he does eat, he sins against his vow. If he doesn't eat, he sins against his own life. So it's contrary to Jewish law to commit suicide. So the suggestion was to go to the rabbis and they'll find a way to release them from the vow. And that's what these 40 odd men would have done. Meanwhile, back in verse 15, they have their advice to the Sanhedrin. Now, therefore, it is because of the vow do ye with the council signify to the chief captain. So what they're saying is, you guys, you need to do this. The entire Sanhedrin is now part of the conspiracy. And they were to ask the chiliarch or the captain for we need to have another meeting with Paul. We need to get some more information from Paul. That he bring him down onto you. They said, you need to bring him down onto us. You need to bring Paul to our meeting chamber, our hall of judgment, so that, the first meeting was in the fortress, but now we need to be meeting down here in the hall of judgment, which is under Sanhedrin authority. And, between the Antonia fortress and the hall of judgment, the route to the hall of judgment would expose Paul, where they could ambush him. The stated purpose here was so that they might make further inquiries concerning Paul. They were to simply tell him that they need to speak with Paul further to ascertain what were his crimes. They were to judge more exactly what were his crimes. Then they say, and we, the conspirators, the 40 odd, before he comes near, that is, before Paul makes it to the hall of judgment, we are ready to slay him. We'll kill him. So their purpose in all this, that before Paul can make it to the hall of judgment, they would ambush and assassinate him. And in doing this, undoubtedly, some of them would be killed by the Roman soldiers, but they were all willing to do it. Now, in this conspiracy, we see three groups came together against Paul. We had the Pharisees. Remember, not all the Pharisees were on Paul's side. We had the Pharisees, we had second the Sadducees, and then we had the Zealots, the Sicarii men, the dagger men. And that is our lot for this week. Our contact details are there if you need to contact us. Thank you for joining in. Let's